Happy American birthday, Saturn. Let's celebrate by talking about one of your worst ports. Hello friends, I'm Joe. This is Same Name Different Game, and earlier this month, on an episode of SNDG Gaiden, I dove into the Japanese Sega Saturn library to compare it with the Western libraries and see what could have been. I wanted to focus on the positive, much of which unfortunately was left on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. But in this episode, we're gonna get down and dirty. But before we get into the Saturn, let's get started with our game for this episode, Virtua Fighter, and a little history on it. Virtua Fighter was developed by Sega's AM2 division, headed by Yu Suzuki, the man some have called Sega's equivalent to Shigeru Miyamoto. Suzuki designed many of Sega's arcade hits, Hang On, Outrun, Afterburner, and on the list goes. Arcade games were traditionally meant to be big and flashy to draw in players, and while Sega's super scalar arcade games like Outrun and Afterburner definitely did that, in 1993 Suzuki and AM2 released a sure attention getter. The first ever 3D fighting game on Sega's brand new Model 1 arcade board. Now, 3D games existed before this. Certainly, if you count vector-based games like Atari's Star Wars, 3D arcade games had been around for at least a decade prior to Virtua Fighter. But fighting games were huge in 1993, and seeing this big, colorful cabinet with fully realized 3D fighters, how could you not plunk in a couple of quarters? It is difficult to overstate the importance and influence of Virtua Fighter. In something of an ironic twist, the Sony PlayStation was originally planned as a 2D powerhouse, until Ken Kutaragi and others at Sony saw Virtua Fighter for the first time. And never mind the ocean of imitators the game spawned in arcades, a sea of 3D fighters. But is that original still any good? Well, no, it's not. It's very basic at its core, with only 2 attack buttons plus a guard button, and a cast of just 8 fighters and 1 boss. In gameplay, it had no chance of hanging with Super Turbo on the arcade floor, but it also gets points for offering something quite different. While Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and SNK's entire suite of fighters at this time offered fantastic abilities like throwing energy from your hands, lighting your fists on fire, or swinging a sword so hard it creates a tornado, Virtua Fighter remains fairly grounded. There are no fireballs or sonic booms here, only hand-to-hand combat. While characters can still jump absurdly high, their techniques are largely in line with the real fighting styles on which they're based. I mean, sure, giving a body slam to an unwilling opponent is pretty tough, but it's more possible than charging your entire body with electricity. Unfortunately, the controls are quite clunky, and much like the original Street Fighter, would be vastly improved in the sequels. Similarly, the core gameplay just isn't there yet. The dynamics of things like when you're open for punishment from an opponent and when you aren't often don't make sense. And in the arcade version in particular, the AI can be a bit dumb, as you see here. But none of that really mattered at the time. People, including my 11-year-old self, were just blown away by the graphics and presentation, which unfortunately are a bit off here in MAME, showing some graphical glitches, but I think you get the idea. Whether the game is actually good or not, it was successful, and that meant that Sega was going to push it onto their home consoles, starting with the Sega Saturn. But before we get to this port, well, it is the Saturn's 25th North American birthday after all, so let's dive back in with a little more history. It seems unlikely that if you're watching this show, you're unaware of what I'm about to tell you, but indulge me while I set the stage. In 1995, the Sega Mega Drive had pretty well shown itself to be a failure in the Japanese market. But in North America, where it was known as the Genesis, as well as in Europe, the system thrived. Tom Kalinske, Sega of America president and CEO from 1990 to 1996, was effectively in charge of both North America and Europe when it came to Sega, and under his leadership, the Genesis outsold the Super NES in those territories for some time, though the Super Nintendo did eventually pull up to even in North America. The Sega Saturn, the follow-up to the Genesis, launched in Japan in late 1994. While console launches today tend to happen around the globe, sometimes on the same day, often within a few days, in the 90s it was common to see gaps of a year or so between the Japanese release of a new system and the North American launch. And this was planned to be the case with the Saturn as well. It hit Japan in November of 1994, and Kalinske and his marketing machine were building hype for Saturn Day, set for Saturday, September 2nd, 1995. But since this video is meant to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the system's launch, you know that changed. At the behest of Sega of Japan, who had apparently boiled the Western success of the Genesis down to it came out before the Super Nintendo, a surprise launch was set to coincide with Kalinske's media briefing at the very first E3 on Thursday, May 11th, 1995. This would ensure a 5-month lead over Sony's forthcoming PlayStation. Kalinske has made no bones about how bad of an idea he thought this was, with a lot of his argument being that over the course of a career in the toy business, he'd made business connections with retailers, and the allotment of Saturns that they were getting was simply not enough to cover all of those retailers. Tom, as we know, was correct. The May 11th surprise launch was a disaster, for more than a few reasons. But first and foremost, as Kalinske predicted, the minuscule supply left a ton of retailers burned. Both big box stores like Target, Walmart, and Best Buy, as well as important specialty retailers like KB Toys, who straight up ended their relationship with Sega following this debacle. But that wasn't all. Several third-party publishers and developers weren't clued in either, which of course didn't make them happy. In a move Sega of Japan was convinced would keep Sega in the driver's seat, they managed to burn enough bridges to erase basically all of the goodwill that they had built up in the prior 5 years, with both business partners and players. On May 11, 1995, there were 6 Sega Saturn games available in North America: Panzer Dragoon, Clockwork Knight, Daytona USA, Pebble Beach Golf Links, Worldwide Soccer, and packed in with the $400 configuration of the hardware, the game we're talking about today, Virtua Fighter. And I'm sorry to say, yikes. This port feels rough. I don't know how else to really describe it. It was ported by AM2 themselves, but the Saturn was notoriously hard to program for, so maybe that's it. Or maybe it was rushed. I can't offer anything but speculation on that front. But what I can offer is my honest appraisal of the game. which is that it is even worse than its arcade counterpart. The graphics are a mess, with frequent popping in and out, particularly during the replays, but even during normal play. The floor does weird stuff. It's just not what you expect from Sega, who had a history to this point of pretty awesome arcade ports, even when they fell short of their source material in some ways. On the gameplay front, this is Virtua Fighter, alright, but those AI issues seem to have been ironed out, to the point where it's become completely frustrating. I'm sensing a little bit of that CPU is reading your controller inputs that Mortal Kombat 2 does, but maybe I'm just a scrub. But check that. I'm definitely a scrub, but not this much of a scrub. Just put it like this. On the default settings, this version is way harder than the arcade on the default settings. Beyond that, there's not a ton to say. It's not like this game adds much to the equation. There aren't any extra modes or anything like that. The only thing I can mention that qualifies as even kinda significant is that now you can change characters when continuing, which the arcade version does not allow. But this almost becomes more frustrating, because if you plan to stick with your same character, you now have to wait for the character select screen to load, and then wait for the fight you just got out of to load again. Also, while I get that this was meant to be a showcase for the system, it kind of fails there too. Virtua Fighter 2 is in arcades by this time, which isn't just a better playing game, but looks head and shoulders above what the first game did. Virtua Fighter features flat shaded polygons that aren't exactly small. I mean, Panzer Dragoon, another Saturn launch title, looks considerably more impressive. But forget about Panzer Dragoon. What's crazy is that later in 1995, in fact, within a month of the planned September Saturn Day launch, Sega released Virtua Fighter Remix, an updated port of the original game using its sequel's graphics. And even crazier than that, in the same year after the Saturn launch, they released Virtua Fighter on the Sega 32X. I'll spare you a third history lesson in this episode, but suffice it to say the 32X was a massive commercial flop that, depending on how you count, had between 30 and 40 games released for it. It was largely meant to bridge the gap between Genesis and Saturn, but in Japan, it actually released at almost the same time as the latter. And this port of Virtua Fighter, it came out in October of 1995 in Japan, almost a full year after the Saturn version. Bafflingly, this port was also handled by AM2 themselves, and honestly, for as much as you can dunk on the 32X itself, the quality shows here. Not only in the fact that this game plays better than the Saturn version in my opinion, but also that it has additional modes and options not in the Saturn port. There are multiple camera options, a tournament mode, and a ranking mode. That last one apparently is accessible in the Saturn game with a cheat device, but I don't think that counts. This port also does some really creative things with the graphics. As you can see in the normal fights, things look pretty blocky. And the bits that you can knock off characters in the other versions, like Pai's hat and Kage's headband, they no longer do that. But on the character select screen and the win screens, since there's only one character in the frame, these screens use higher polygon models that much more closely resemble the characters as they appear in the arcade version. A lesser developer probably wouldn't have even bothered. But AM2 is not a lesser developer. Where it unfortunately suffers is in the audio department. While the Saturn port clearly uses recordings of the arcade music, the 32X and Genesis can neither do that, nor can the hardware replicate the music of the original Model 1 arcade board. What we get is an admirable attempt, and the music certainly isn't bad, it's just not the original. Also, one final quirk. In the other versions, the end credits show actual replays of your wins, but in the 32X version, it's a canned set of animations. An unexpectedly good port on an inarguable failure of a platform? That makes it one for the curio pile, alright. But now let's go ahead and do like we always do, with a look and a listen at all three of these side by side.
Fight! One, ready, go! Fight! Two, ready, go! KO! Fight! Three, ready, go! KO!
Even with the graphical artifacts presented by MAME emulation, the arcade still looks the best, though the Saturn gives it the college try, at least when the graphics aren't glitching out. The 32X isn't bad considering this is just a souped up Genesis, and again, on the windscreen you could probably mistake those high polygon models for the other versions. Audio-wise, the arcade and Saturn are identical, so the 32X comes in behind, obviously. And that makes it time to give the edge. And obviously, even if MAME plays it a little wonky, it's the arcade version. And of course, MAME is going to be the best option for most folks, but I will say, if you have the option of playing it on a real board, that's definitely the way to go. When it comes to these home ports, I know this was supposed to be a celebration of all things Saturn, but I gotta give it to the 32X version. It controls better, it has more modes, it has more options, it's a better version. But the real takeaway here is that none of these are really worth playing. Not in a world where VF2, VF3, VF4, and VF5 exist. Couple that with the fact that these ports cost about $20 a piece in the current aftermarket, and you're much better off spending that cash on any one of the sequels. Even Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn is a massive step up from the original. And that does it. But after that, I kind of feel like I need to spread some Sega love. So, come back next month when I will be talking about one of my all-time favorite games on the Genesis. I'll see you then. Hey folks, this is Joe, and thank you so much for watching. If you dug the show, do all this stuff. Like, subscribe, hit that dumb bell, not a dumbbell, but the dumb bell, and comment below which of the Saturn launch games was your favorite. It was probably Panzer Dragoon, although shoutouts to Craig the Walrus Statler. If you really dug it, consider supporting the show on Patreon. Just $1 per video gets you early access, the chance to vote on future video topics, your name here with these cool people, and more. If you missed my earlier video on the Japanese Saturn library, it's on the left. And if you want more fighting game goodness, the Street Fighter Alpha episode is on the right.